the week past and the outlook for the week ahead. Let's kick off with our regular Sunday commentator, Christophe Roule, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Good morning, Christophe. The week in review, I don't know, there's so many things to think about, and we'll touch on some of them as we go through our call. Obviously, India stands out amongst many of the headlines, but I think from a market point of view, what's really sort of grabbed my attention over the last few days was the fact that the European Union PMI number hit a record while Germany went into a further lockdown. And the idea being that the major economies like Germany are now coexisting with resurgent COVID infections and simply continuing to grow. Your thoughts on that thesis?
That might be true, but I think it's also a growing realization that with the success of vaccination, even if elsewhere, even if the core countries in Europe still are lagging beyond the UK and beyond Israel and beyond the US, it's a growing realization that this COVID threat can be put behind us with the emergence of vaccination. I think that's the most important insight. And then, of course, as you say, there's also evidence from the past that the economies are growing, and in Germany they're growing very strongly, despite repeated lockdowns, despite all these headaches which cause to the actual operations. And I can tell you that with confidence. Here in Germany, we're sitting in this old house, as you know, and we're trying to renovate bits and pieces. And there are serious supply chain issues here. I mean, you can't get a kitchen within 3 months or so. You cannot. I have the heating guy here all the time. He complains he cannot install heaters because he doesn't get the steel, which usually comes from the Czech Republic. I have a brother who is working in the construction industry, and they have serious bottlenecks there. And of course, prices are escalating. And this is the kind of environment in which you generally observe an economy which, if anything, has excess demand and not excess supply. There's no unemployment, at least in this part here. It's hard to get any kind of labor services. So yes, it's two things. It's backward looking, an adjustment to the current situation where business continues. It's also, of course, some losers who are not having a big voice in PMI indices, like mostly the service industry. It's not manufacturing, so it doesn't show up there. And secondly, it is, I think, the knowledge by looking elsewhere that this beast can be, if not eliminated, then controlled.
Let's welcome to the table Jorge Montepecchio, the president of General Index. Jorge, it's hard to think much beyond all things India this last week. An unbelievable set of challenges that they're facing, inevitably with it, an economy that's slowly grinding to a halt or maybe rapidly doing so. Tokyo as well into a lockdown, Japan facing similar challenges. Do these slowly accumulate to being of a scale that could derail the demand recovery outlook that's expected by OPEC and others?
Well, let's first start by some observational issues occurring in India. As part of my job for General Index, I talked to my sources in India. And as I was talking to some of them last week, they were either coming out of hospital or had recently had COVID. And their relatives had either recently had COVID or had been in hospital. And from other people I know, I was shocked by one statement where one company, 1 out of 3 individuals was undergoing COVID. So in some areas, COVID is really extensive. And we all read the news about the deaths, the lack of oxygen, the various things going in. But as you think through, there are various issues. Number one is if COVID is very extensive as it is, it means that within 2 months, they're going to be ever closer to herd immunity, if not sooner, because everybody that can have it will have it. So I was thinking, is this really negative or is this potentially positive? And I was having a discussion with somebody from IOC about what this was going to do to demand, which is really your core question. And I don't know if we were bouncing the same idea back and forth among each other, but we felt that the behavior of the people, despite COVID, wasn't going to change very much. They are still attending the political rallies. They attended all the religious festivals, and they're carrying on like nothing is happening, even though so many people are suffering. And the conclusion was from that discussion with IOC that most likely refining demand will continue very strong through the summer, and that the impact is actually going to be muted in terms of energy demand. Is going to have some impact across the supply chain. And this is something for Christoph to analyze further in his job, really. But oxygen is being diverted from a refinery use into hospital use. And this will impact the production of the sulfurized fuels, because in order to extract the sulfur, you need the oxygen in the unit. But right now, essentially, the effort is to put the oxygen into hospitals. And I was also being told that even oxygen from steel plants was being diverted for medical use. So it's quite a serious issue. But again, people are inventive and they get around the issues, and demand for fuels continues, would be my end result.
John, can I say something?
Please, yes.
Because I like words, but I like sometimes numbers even more. And there's some things I cannot get my head around when I listen to these stories about India. First, I want to say, there is, of course, there's an unprecedented scale of human suffering, and I don't want to belittle that in any way. And I think it is unaccounted for, because the numbers which are published, the numbers we all unfortunately get excited about, don't make sense. Right? India has about 1.4 billion people. It hit the headlines because it had a daily infection rate of about, 260,000, I think the headline number was. Yeah. Germany has 80 million people. It has a daily infection rate of between 26 and 30,000, which is considered to be low. India has about 15 to 20, say 15 times as many people in Germany, and the infection rate is just 10 times as high. If I go by the official numbers, there isn't a huge scandal here. That's the first observation. And the second observation is, I don't think that the diversion of oxygen from refining or steel industry is any kind of significant order of magnitude. The problem of India is the problem of why most poor countries are suffering disproportionately. And it's not in the numbers, because the numbers are all made up and unaccounted for. The problem is, number one, people are living in slums and so close to each other, they cannot effectively practice what we call social distances. They just infect each other. They're uninformed. And number two, shall we put it mildly, it's the health system is completely overwhelmed. And I would bet they would not even be able to divert, these oxygen carriages and effectively use them in hospital. It's just overwhelmed. It's not well equipped. It is not very competent. It's not very well organized. I spent a lot of time in India. It's sad to say, but it's not the fault of India. It's the fault of not having the infrastructure and the money to counter this. And this is something which you can see replicated to some extent in Brazil. It's something which I would guess you can see replicated in other parts of Africa or Southeast Asia, wherever rates tick up. And where rates tick up or not is, that was my first big point, not necessarily in the numbers. So I appreciate the spotlight being thrown on this, but I mean, all of us should, sometimes just look at these numbers and think them over before we repeat them ad nauseam.
Well, I suppose ultimately it's which number do you look at? I mean, it's the burning funeral pyres. Do you count the number of those? It's clearly a scale that is beyond the infrastructure's capability.
Yeah, you look at the queues in front of the hospital.
And there is no doubt about that. The challenge within the context of where we're looking through our rather self-interested prism, from the point of view, Jorge, OPEC are meeting this week again to map out, tweak or not tweak, or do anything about their current output policy. They've only met a few weeks ago, obviously. They're now indicating that this meeting will be downgraded to simply a review session. What's your makeup of the challenge that they face through these kind of inconsistencies, PMIs through the roof in Europe, Germany, and lockdown? How do you, I mean, up till now, they've been guided by the vaccine rollout.
We can spend a lot of time on this, so I'll try to be very short. Numbers provide the backbone of our analysis, but numbers are suspect. And they're non-comparable from one country to another because, as Christoph was saying, they don't have the infrastructure. So you cannot trust data in one area or another. Here in London, just to give you an example, I know of many students that self-test. They come out positive, but they don't report their positivity to the central authorities. So you cannot trust the numbers, and the numbers are retrospective as well. By the time the number comes out, the world has moved on. So we need to be, and I'm going to disagree with Christoph here, extremely currently observational. What are our observations of markets, of industry behavior, of people telling us now? And what the behavior tell us right now is people are moving in their cars, they're going to restaurants, they're buying things from Amazon. The factories in China are 24% operating industrial activity higher than last year. PMI is up. Things are good. Why are they good? There is a lot of government support for employment. So people that would be unemployed aren't. And people that are having income, lucky people like ourselves, we start looking around the house, as Christoph say, and say, my world has narrowed in. What can I do in that world? What do I need to improve? So things are actually rather good, I would say, globally, actually, not just in Europe, not just in America. If we look at the front page of the Wall Street Journal, rents start to go up in the US. It's a very positive environment. But what will OPEC do? OPEC looks at the retrospective data. They take into account what is happening in India and all these places, and they're going to have opposing data coming in. Some of it, as I indicated, very old and untrustworthy. What is the end result likely to be? Non-action. Because the pressures are there to supply what the market wants. And inventories are being destroyed so rapidly across. This is why I was so bullish in the last session we had, because inventories are just coming down and demand continues to increase. But Christoph maybe can add on to those things as well, Sean.
Christoph, just to, before you jump in there, to add on the point of the bullish glass half full, we saw in the US last week unemployment numbers down to the lowest since the COVID pandemic, unemployment claims the lowest since the pandemic started. And you mentioned yourself trying to get your kitchen equipment in Germany. Lumber, the futures contract for lumber is up 50% year to date. I mean, these inflation numbers across the commodity profile are significant. And some people are saying they're not significant because they aren't impacting wage increases. And so you don't have to worry about inflation until it impacts wages. So that's a lot to pack into one. But ultimately, are we underestimating the glass half full and inflation could kick the door down?
So to some extent, yes, I would agree with Jorge that the global situation looks good, at least for the part of the world we usually concentrate on. There is this K-shaped recovery. There are these dark spots like India. That is also true. But then you have to distinguish. There is severe bottlenecks, but they mostly affect manufactured goods, often white goods, often home appliances, which have two characteristics. Once they have been in enormous demand for people fixing houses and so on, especially the construction side. And secondly, they are developed like steel from a raw product into a final, whatever it is, a boiler or a kitchen or a refrigerator, a white good, goes through many countries in their supply chain. These seem to be most affected. Service industries, of course, are hit very hard, but not affected by these bottlenecks. So far, the energy sector has also, by and large, escaped being affected by these bottlenecks. The second point on inflation, it's not determined by these bottlenecks. Whenever we have this kind of crisis, we make the same experience, which is that our market system, the global system, is enormously successful in immediately addressing and alleviating these kind of bottlenecks within a matter of months, never longer than a year usually. And I bet you this will apply even to the lumber shortage. It's in Germany now, you can get lumber because it goes also into the US construction industry. And these things have a high propensity of being corrected. And also, as you said, the inflationary numbers will be composed of the whole economy. And in many of the key countries, especially in the US, the service sector is much, much larger. And the service sector is, if anything, still more depressed than it was last year, different from the manufacturing sector. But the third point, addressing also, taking up the ball where Jorge left it, I think we have to realize that we are not only now economically in a pretty decent starting position, it's also starting a position, still an early position. So we are normalizing. But the normalization we are returning to justifies the phrase, it's a new normal. There are things different now. One of the things for the OPEC meeting, or two of the things immediately relevant for the OPEC meeting, is we are seeing now a reaction of the shale industry. The shale industry, like the rest of us, is confronted by this enormous wall of money. And nobody can tell me that discipline, private equity investors and of the shale guys will hold forever when they see profitable possibilities at prices of 60 plus. And when they see the wall of money and the easiness with which it will get, which easier it will become to get financed, they will put one and one together and start producing again. We have characteristics of the shale industry, the drilled and uncompleted wells which are going up, the possibility of hedging, which people are not talking about anymore, which are very important because they replace to some extent the inventories which OPEC has succeeded in working through. So OPEC now faces a credibility challenge on two fronts, or it's just starting, but will face it. One is that the easy to count, easy to control inventories in US and in other consuming countries will be going down successfully, but they will be replaced with this very high flexibility of shale with DUCs, drilled and uncompleted wells, which can come in with a matter of weeks, with hedging if there's a price spike. So the enemy becomes more flexible, so to speak, from OPEC's perspective. And many of the old characteristics which made shale so successful in acquiring market share are coming back, and we're seeing the beginning of this. And at the same time, of course, there's the enemy from within, so to speak, because the inventories have been worked down. The internal spare capacity is still enormously high, and this is now the next challenge to work them do gradually. So one of these aspects of a, if you want, post-COVID new normal carried by economic success is that the challenge for OPEC becomes more intricate, it will not go away. I agree on the next meeting, it will be just, there's nothing much else they can do. If they don't want to surprise by purpose, then they will have to continue the cuts as they are, hope that demand continues to strengthen. But just beneath the horizon of this next month or so, you see in your own, the data which you published and the press thing you published, how the new normal becomes also more difficult to control them.
Jorge, all of this noise of last week and all of the things we've touched on so far, yet oil prices this last week traded in a fairly narrow band, a little bit up, a little bit down, but nothing dramatic given the scale of the drama. What does that tell you about the outlook? And also, in particular, welcome your views on where is China going? There's a certain view at the moment of the market that it's plateauing. So welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this week was interesting from the point of view that there were many bearish elements coming in as the mind went into the COVID reinfection in India, and people were literally very concerned across many jurisdictions, but the demand continued there. And even the numbers in the US were showing a little bit of a build in inventories, but the imports of crude oil into the US are rising week on week, roughly, right? The trend is up. The US needs more oil. India needs more oil, China needs more oil. And when we talk about China plateauing, we should never think in terms of zero economic growth. What we are talking about plateauing is plateauing at an increasing rate of 5%, which means your economy is bigger every year and every year. And if you extrapolate a line of 5% growth, you very soon exceed the US, right? Which is what is going to happen over the next decade. And they need oil. They're also making statements about reducing carbon. And if you're logical about it, the easiest thing to reduce carbon is to reduce coal consumption. It's the simplest. And China said it's going to do that. And immediately my head goes, well, if you reduce coal, what are you going to use instead? LNG, oil, what are your options? Are you going to go wind? I think the immediate alternative is LNG and oil. So this is all extremely positive for the industry. And as we move forward, I can see that boiling, simmering of inflation. And this is going to be a major issue for the policymakers over the next 2 years, because we're just seeing the beginning of the coming back. I think we're all sort of agreeing, rightly or wrongly, that COVID is a little bit behind us, even if we have these flare-ups. But how are we all going to behave? Are we all going to book tickets to go somewhere? Are we going to book tickets and spaces in restaurants? And we're going to be traveling everywhere? I think so. And
but it certainly seems in a way that if COVID's behind us, but our ability to coexist with it does seem to be rather impressive, if that's the right word. Let's get the rest of the room's view before giving you guys a sense of outlook for the week ahead. The EU PMIs reached record levels last week as Germany extended its lockdown, and obviously all things that happened in India. COVID pandemic will have less and less impact on economic growth, regardless of infection rates. Agree or disagree? Again, to kind of get your head around that, COVID pandemic will have less and less impact on economic growth, regardless of infection rates. Agree or disagree? That is one worth thinking about. Christoph, the week ahead, your thoughts, what do you think guides the market, things you might be looking at?
I looked through the numbers, through the announcements. So there is some PMI data coming from the US, there's some inflation data coming from Europe, but nothing to write home about. Last Sunday, sort of as a general theme, we discussed this world with having the COVID recovery more diversity. And India is now a beautiful example for that. This time, I want to add something on China and OPEC also. When the topic is how does this new normal now of COVID to some extent, when we learn to coexist, is probably better than to say it's behind us. When we learn to coexist, what this new normal looks like. One of the aspects is that China had a credit problem and a stability problem and a potential inflation problem already before COVID. A lot of zombie banks, a lot of enormous rise of debt to GDP, all these indicators. And China, of course, was hit much less by COVID economically than the US or than Europe, and recovered first, and so went very strongly. So I would be very careful on China, because that is an economy where they will now have to work out some of these debt and credit issues which they have, and that will go at the expense of economic growth. One part for me of the new normal will be China growing more in the region of 6% minus something, minus X, than at the old 8% or so. And that will damage oil demand. Of course, they want to get off their coal, but nobody in his right mind, and certainly not in China, will start replacing coal-fired power stations with oil. So that's not happening, I think. So there will be an effect there. And also on the recovery in the US, one still has ways to go. I was puzzled in your show because different people always quote different flight numbers. So one of the things I did, I was trying to look it up before we met today. And because sometimes they are based on capacity numbers, but then it doesn't take into account that the numbers of flight has been reduced. So if you have 100% capacity, but only half the flights, you haven't really moved much.
Right, of course.
One of the things I would recommend to people, and I'm not sure it exists for other countries, it might, is the US publishes something from the TSA, and the TSA is these security guys, transport security, I don't know, the bulky guys who check you at the airport. They
guys who take your shoes off.
Yeah, and you know that you can't escape them. So they publish daily numbers in the numbers of passengers, and I think they must be pretty accurate because you can't really escape these guys. And they indicate that in 2019, BC, before COVID, we had about on average, more or less 2.5 million passengers per day. Now we are going up pretty fast, but we are only at about 1.5 million per day. In 2020, we were down to about 100,000 per day. So there's huge differences, but we are still far from where we used to be, even in the US in 2019. Now, that indicates that as long as the engine sort of, as we agree, it starts humming and it goes going, there's some slack to take care of and to go for. And this is a nice picture for the general economy. We will see a very speedy, very good recovery, everybody talking about high economic growth, as long as the slack can be taken up of existing factories, existing airline fleets, existing cars, all these things we have. The real question of the long-term damage for growth of COVID comes when it's in the longer time horizon, and the issue is of capacity expansion, of investment, of long-term consumer purchases. And on that one, the jury is still up. Don't forget, in the long term, we were on a declining growth trend. And this is why the Biden people are so keen on the infrastructure program, because they know catching up with slack, with capacity which was idle and underused now, is not the same as generating long-term growth. And on the catch-up front, I'm very optimistic. On the longer term, might be that we see some COVID damage also from big economies like India falling by the wayside globally, which we have not yet estimated. But in the short term, to answer your last question too, there's also going to come an inflationary problem, yes, at the end of this year.
Let's get the survey result and give Jorge the last word this morning. Agree 60%, disagree 40%. COVID pandemic will have less and less impact on economic growth, regardless of infection rates. 60% agree. Jorge, the week ahead, of course, as we noted at the beginning, there is an OPEC meeting. His Highness, the Minister of Energy of Saudi, has surprised us a number of times this year. Should we discount that there will be no surprise this week? Anything else you'll be watching over the coming days?
Yeah, I'm going to be watching if the tone starts to change, because what a lot of us are looking at is the rate at which Saudi Arabia returns accelerates, because we shouldn't forget Iran. Iran is coming in, and Saudi Arabia has the capacity to balance out the Iranian entry. We're still talking many months into the future, but I think it's closer and closer becoming a reality. The other thing that we didn't discuss, but we should keep in the back of our mind, is the conflict with Yemen and the drones affecting the area, because that's another aspect that adds to the general bullishness of the marketplace. All these instruments of war are becoming more and more precise and have greater and greater reach. And being the type of optimistic guy I am, is I hope that leads to a balance rather than to an escalation. That the two sides,
which makes me think, Jorge, that given the precision of these weapons, we're seeing actually, I would think, intentional misses, if you know what I mean, that they're not taking things out. The ship we saw overnight yesterday off the coast of Syria, it's a pinprick, the Iranian vessel. These are intentional misses not to escalate, would be my assessment.
I interpret them exactly the same thing. They're intentional misses to send messages to one another. And I am hoping that leads to a detente. And what we are seeing right now is a movement into that detente. The Iranians and the Saudis are already having discussions. That this has been already, is public knowledge in the press. I hope we all like peace, We all like cooperation. We all like growth. And economic growth requires people talking to each other and being able to move goods towards one another. So I am becoming more and more optimistic about the future in your area of the world.
That sounds like a good place to wrap. I was going to wrap up with something kind of less optimistic, but I'll put it out there anyway. The India and the outlook for India the coming week, I think, is a scale that can shock the markets, regardless of whether, once you sort of process the numbers, that it's actually substantial or not. But ultimately, the sentiment, the communication, the images convey are so horrific that they can switch the mood of optimism to other. But in the tangible sense, I think one thing to watch out for, at least according to the scientists who are much better skilled than us to assess this, that when you let or leave a COVID infection to run wild, the potential for variants to emerge that are unmanageable by vaccination become very problematic. And that may be the legacy of this current situation in India, that there could be variants that are problematic, is a minimal word to say, but ultimately we wish the Indian people very well, and hopefully they can get on top of this and everywhere else where the challenge is still very real. Jorge, thank you so much for joining us today. Christoph, as always, really appreciate your insights on an early Sunday morning. Thank you both, and everybody who joined us. We'll catch up with you over the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.